has been so long since I last heard that music. Why, it brings back a flood of memories for me. But oh, so many years have passed. So many things have happened. Why, when I was growing up, I never imagined that I would one day be the wife of the President of the United States. I was a very serious and solemn little girl. I was so serious, my mother nicknamed me Granny, a name which I detest to this day. I think, perhaps, my mother was the most beautiful woman I have ever seen. Anna Livingston Hall, always the belle of the ball. I knew from a very early age that I was a great disappointment to my mother. She once told me that since I did not have good looks, that I should always have the best of manners and always try to be my very best. I have indeed tried to be my very best. You see, my parents were very young when they were married. My mother was just 19, and I followed soon after the wedding. I was born on a sunny Saturday morning, October 11th, 1884, in Long Island, New York. I was born into the golden affluence of the Roosevelt family, one of the oldest and wealthiest families in New York. My father was Elliott Roosevelt, the younger brother of President Theodore Roosevelt, my Uncle Teddy, and my godfather. As I say, my parents were very young when they were married. I don't think either were really prepared for the challenges of raising a child. My poor mama suffered terribly from bouts of depression and migraine headaches. She would often take to her bed for weeks at a time. There have been times when I thought it was my father's behavior that brought on her illnesses. He was either in the throes of alcohol or in the arms of another woman. But nonetheless, I adored him, and I miss him to this day. Sadly, my mother's illnesses would take a toll upon her. She died when she was just 29 years old. She left behind myself, my two younger brothers, Hall and Elliot. Within just a few weeks, little baby Elliot would follow Mama. Our poor father was grief-stricken. You see, we rarely saw him. The family did not feel that our father was capable or responsible enough to look after us. And so my brother and I were shuttled amongst the relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, but mostly my grandmother Hall. We spent most of our time with her at her house at Tivoli, New York. I have always felt as though I really never had a place where I belonged, some place that I could call home. Sadly, my father's behavior, too, would take a toll upon him. He died when he was just 34 years old. He died at the home of one of his lovers. When I was told of my father's death, all that I could say was that I wish I could have seen him just one more time. As I say, my brother and I were shuttled amongst the relatives. I have never really felt comfortable with Aunt Edith and Uncle Teddy, although Uncle Teddy always told me that I was his favorite niece. And I have never cared for my cousin Alice. Oh, for a very good reason. She once referred to me as a withered green bean that had been kept in the basement all winter. And oh, on a visit to Uncle Teddy's at Sagamore Hill, Uncle Teddy found out that I could not swim, and so he threw me in the lake. I sunk like a rock. Well, he fished me out, and he gave me a very stern sermon on how a Roosevelt never shows fear. Well, I began to question my ancestry. When I was 15 years old, my grandmother Hall decided to send me away to school. I was sent to a small school just outside of London, England, called the Allenswood School. Oh, it was run by a magnificent Frenchwoman, Madame Souvesse. Oh, she was so elegant, with masses of white hair. I tried to pattern myself after her. I soon became one of her favorites. And during holiday time, Madame Souvesse would take me to the continent, and we would go to wonderful art galleries, churches, museums. After my experiences with Madame Souvesse, I would no longer be that serious, silent little girl I had been before. Sadly, when I turned 18, I had to leave the Allenswood School. They forced me to graduate. I came back to New York to an endless round of dinners, dances, and teas, all orchestrated to find a husband. For you see, I was the ugly duckling of the family, and this ugly duckling did not grow into a beautiful swan. She just became an ugly duck. And needless to say, not many of the young men were really interested in that ugly duck. But that would all change for me in 1903. I was at a party at my cousin Corinne's house on Park Avenue when I became reacquainted with a distant cousin of mine, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Oh, Franklin and I had known one another for years, but oh, he had changed so much. He was very tall and handsome. He was a college student then. And oh, I thought I'd found my very best friend. It seemed as though we were interested in all of the same things. We both loved reading and poetry. We loved to take long walks together. And soon we would share a love of politics. I really thought I had found my very best friend. I was very surprised to find out that Franklin had other ideas about the ugly duck. He was romantically interested in me. It was the Thanksgiving holiday, and Franklin invited me to his family's estate at Hyde Park to meet his mother. Oh, I had met Sarah Delano many years before. I was hoping she wouldn't remember me. For you see, Franklin was the only son of James and Sarah Roosevelt. James was 52 and Sarah was 26 when Franklin was born. He was her golden prince, and she was not about to share that prince with any other woman. It was after dinner that evening. We were able to slip away for a walk, alone together. It was on that walk that my dearest one proposed to me. Oh, I accepted immediately. Franklin explained that he could not give me a ring at that time since he had not spoken to his mother about his wedding plans. But he gave me this pin, which I have always cherished. Eventually, Franklin did write to Mother Sarah about his wedding plans. Mother Sarah said no. She said we were much too young to know anything about marriage, much less love. But then she finally agreed that if we would keep our engagement a secret for 1 year, she would give her permission. And so in December of 1904, the engagement was announced and the wedding plans were made. The date of March 17th, 1905 was chosen. I did not choose that date. Franklin did not choose that date. Not even Mother Sarah chose that date. It was chosen by the President of the United States, my Uncle Teddy. Apparently, the President would be in New York for the St. Patrick's Day parade, and he would be delighted to give the bride away. We were married in the drawing room of my cousin Corinne's house. Oh, the room was beautifully decorated with sprigs of lilac and orange blossom. I wore a lovely ivory brocade gown with lace that had belonged to my mother and my grandmother. For once in my life, I really felt beautiful. As I approached my waiting groom, he whispered, "I am the luckiest man in the world." I replied, "I am the luckiest woman." Immediately after the ceremony, Franklin and I found ourselves alone with Mother Sarah. Apparently, all of the guests had really come to see the President of the United States and not to attend a wedding. And so, as soon as the President left, so did all of the guests. Oh, but Mother Sarah, she had seen to everything. She planned a 3.5-month honeymoon for us to Europe, complete with a chaperone. Oh, we visited all of the capitals and the tourist spots of Europe. Franklin constantly took photographs of me. I've never really felt very comfortable in front of the camera. But there was one photo. I believe Franklin took that one in Venice, and I've always liked that one. While we were on our honeymoon, I wrote to Mother Sarah nearly every day. I told her she was really very lucky now. She had 2 children to love her. I wanted her to love me just a little bit. I wanted her to find a small corner of her heart for me. Oh, I had once told Franklin that it was our duty to make sure that Mother Sarah was happy. Little did I know what a heavy duty that would be. Oh, and the trip home aboard the ship was dreadful. I was seasick the entire time. I spent the entire journey below deck in our cabin. When I arrived in New York, I found out that I was not seasick. I was pregnant with our first child. Anna Eleanor was born the following spring of 1906. She would be followed by 5 sons. Why, in the first 12 years of my marriage, I felt as though I were preparing to deliver a baby, delivering a baby, or recovering from a baby. Of all my children, I think the most beautiful one was my third child, Franklin the First. Oh, he was such a sturdy baby when he was born. He weighed nearly 11 pounds. But sadly, when he was just 7 months old, he passed away. I thought that I would never stop crying. Surprisingly, it was Mother Sarah who came to my aid. She would sit with me for hours on end as I wept. She made bottomless cups of tea. She even spoke to Franklin. She told him that he should be more patient, kind, and gentle with me. Well, eventually, I did recover from that loss. But I have never forgotten that beautiful baby. Well, as our little family grew, so did Franklin's political ambitions. In 1910, Franklin was elected to the New York State Legislature, and so we moved our little family to Albany. Oh, I was so excited. This was the first time in my life that I would have a home of my own. I was so thrilled to be out buying linens, towels, dishes. I rearranged the furniture constantly. And I became the perfect legislator's wife. I would don my best hat and those white gloves. I knew all of the legislators and their families by name. Whenever possible, I would go to the floor of the legislature to hear Franklin speak. But I knew that was only a stepping stone to something much higher. In 1914, Franklin was appointed as the Undersecretary of the Navy, and so we moved our family to Washington. And this time, I became the perfect cabinet member's wife. Best hat, white gloves. I knew everybody in Washington, and everybody knew me. I became so busy that it was necessary to hire a social secretary. We hired a very well-educated young woman by the name of Lucy Mercer. Oh, Lucy. She was everything I was not. She was extremely beautiful. Portrait painters all over the East Coast clamored to have her as their model. And she was very witty. As the Great War came to an end in 1918, Franklin was sent to France to oversee the closing of a naval installation there. Upon his return trip home, he was dreadfully ill with pneumonia and the influenza. So many of the young men had died from the influenza. Franklin was so ill that he had to be carried off the ship. When he arrived home, I cared for him, night and day. One evening, I was putting away some of Franklin's things when I came across a packet of letters addressed to my husband. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was that of my secretary, Lucy Mercer. I hesitated to read those letters, but I did. It became immediately evident that the letters were of a very intimate nature. I was so angry with Franklin, I wanted to confront him about those letters. I could not sleep at all that night. The following morning, I asked him bluntly, "Are you in love with Lucy Mercer?" He would not answer me. I raised my voice and I asked him again, "Are you in love with Lucy?" He finally said yes. Yes, he did love her, but he still loved me. I immediately offered him a divorce. Mother Sarah said no. She said there would be no such scandal in the family. Franklin said that a divorce would destroy his political chances. It was then that I decided that I would stay with him. I would continue to be his helpmate, his political advisor, but I would no longer be his wife. From that day on, Franklin and I never spent another night together as husband and wife. In that summer of 1919, I thought the bottom had fallen out of my world. I wrote to a friend of mine about the difficulties with Franklin. I told her that I did not think I loved him any longer. I admired him, I respected him, but I no longer loved him. She wrote back, "Eleanor, you're wrong. When you start loving someone, you just don't quit." How right she was. No matter how dark, how difficult those days may have been, we would be facing a much greater challenge in the very near future. In the summer of 1921, it was August 23rd. We were vacationing at our home at Campobello off the coast of Maine. Oh, whenever we were there, Franklin behaved like one of the children. He would run and swim and hike and bicycle all day long. It was toward evening. I was sitting on the back porch of the house reading when I saw Franklin approaching on a winding path. It appeared that he was having a great deal of difficulty walking. When he came to me, he said that his legs were very heavy and that his back was aching terribly. I told him that a hot bath and early to bed and he'd be right by morning. It was just all of the activity. That evening I took a supper tray to him. He said the pain in his legs had grown much worse. By the next morning, he could barely stand. By that evening, he could not stand at all. After much argumentation, the doctors would finally diagnose that Franklin had contracted infantile paralysis, polio, and furthermore, that he would never walk again. And so began another battle with Mother Sarah. She wanted Franklin to retire to Hyde Park and collect stamps. I knew that is not what he wanted, and that was not what I wanted for him. Franklin would not give up the idea of walking again. He would read everything that he could find on the subject of polio and its treatment. He came across a small town in Georgia called Warm Springs. Apparently, there were mineral bars there, and the victims of polio had almost miraculous results from swimming in that water. And so it was off to Warm Springs. Franklin loved the place. I hated it. But it seemed that he did have results from swimming in that water. There was a young physical therapist there by the name of Alice Converse. Alice was from Superior, Wisconsin. Alice designed and built heavy steel braces to aid Franklin in his walking, 10 pounds on each leg. Franklin would don those braces, walk up and down the driveway, perspiration pouring from him. But he would not give up the idea of walking again. And he would not give up the idea of running for office again. During our days in Albany, we had become acquainted with a newspaper man by the name of Louis Howe. Oh, Louis. He was the dirtiest human being I have ever met. He always smelled of cigars and whiskey, but he had an amazing political mind, and he adored Franklin. Louis told me that it was my job to keep Franklin's name alive in front of the public. I was terrified of speaking at public meetings, but Louis would drag me to these meetings, and as I spoke in the front of the room, Louis sat in the back and made faces at me. Well, I learned to speak in public, and I kept Franklin's name alive. Franklin was elected as the governor of New York in 1928, but I knew his aspirations lay much higher. In 1929, our country was plunged into the greatest economic depression it had ever known. Factories closed. Thousands of Americans were thrown out of work. People lost their homes. Farmers lost their land. Many Americans were starving. The Hoover administration was unwilling or unable to help. But Franklin thought he had a plan. Franklin was elected to his first term in the presidency in 1932. He immediately went to work on an alphabet soup of plans. There was the WPA, the CCC, the NRA. Some were successful, others were not. I knew when I entered the White House as the First Lady that I no longer had a personal life. Everything that I said, everything that I did, everything that I wore was public knowledge. You see, I entered the White House as a very reluctant First Lady. I did not want to be the typical First Lady who presides over receptions and pours tea. I wanted a real job in the administration. I offered to sort Franklin's mail, but he said that would hurt the secretary's feelings. But it was Louis Howe who would come to my rescue. Louis told the president I could go where he could not. I could be Franklin's eyes, ears, and legs. And so Franklin gave me permission to travel across America. In the days of the Great Depression, I would travel nearly 23,000 miles. I was often accompanied on my journeys by a New York State trooper by the name of Earl Miller. Earl taught me how to drive a car, and Earl taught me how to shoot a gun. And so off we would go in my little blue Plymouth with a pistol under the seat next to me. Oh, Earl. We traveled thousands of miles together. We had become very fond of one another. The newspapers began referring to us as Mr. and Mrs. Miller. That's enough about Earl. As I was saying, during those Great Depression days, I traveled nearly 23,000 miles. I walked through the apple orchards of Washington State, into the vineyards of California, into the Dust Bowl that was once Oklahoma. I went into the cornfields of the Midwest, into the lumber camps of the Great North. I went down into coal mines in Kentucky and West Virginia. In Pennsylvania, I met a young woman who had 8 children of her own, but she still found time to organize a milk fund for the poor children of her township. In New York, I met a family who had lost their home. They were living in an abandoned sewer. When I would return to the White House, I would bring all of these things back to Franklin. Sometimes at night, I would sit on the bottom of his bed, and I would tell him all about the people and the places I had seen. No matter what I did or what I said, it never, ever seemed to shock or surprise Franklin. He liked to joke that I was so rarely at home in the White House that one morning he would open the newspaper and the headline would read, "First Lady Spends a Night in the White House." Well, when I was at home at the White House, it had become our custom that in the morning, Franklin and I would have coffee together, just to go over the events of the day. Well, one morning I had to leave very early for a speaking engagement in Baltimore at a women's prison. Nobody bothered to tell the president that I was gone. Poor Franklin sat there, waiting and waiting. He finally came out into the hallway and asked one of the secretaries, "Where's my missus?" The young lady replied, "Oh, sir, haven't you heard? She's gone to prison." Well, not even that seemed to surprise Franklin. He merely said, "Oh, no. What did she do now?" Sadly, our country would not be released from the grips of that Great Depression until the machines of war began to churn. By 1939, Mr. Hitler was making a great deal of noise in Germany, and in Italy, Mr. Mussolini was making even more noise. And in Japan, the greatest military force the world had ever seen was on the march. I knew America would soon be involved in that war. I shall never forget the night of December 7th, 1941. I was in my office at the White House. I looked out onto a darkened Washington. They were putting up blackout curtains throughout the White House and mounting guns on the roof. I thought about all the young men who would be lost in this war, all those mothers' sons. I thought about my own 4 sons and what it would be like to lose them. I thought, is my freedom worth their dying? Am I worth their dying? As in the days of the Great Depression, I wanted a real job in the war effort. Franklin gave me permission to travel across America. I went down into shops, into airplane factories, where young women were working for the war effort. But that was not enough for me. I wanted to see the real war. Franklin gave me permission to travel overseas. I have walked through the devastated streets of London. I saw the bombed homes, churches, schools. I visited orphanages there. I visited hospitals in Australia and New Guinea. In Australia, I met a young Marine, just 19 years old. His legs had been amputated. He did not want to write home to tell his mother what had happened. He asked if I could please speak with her. I said, no problem. I would be more than happy to. That young man offered me his Purple Heart. I told him there is no way that I could ever have earned such an award, for you see, I am a coward. There were so many fine young men and women serving our nation. I could relate hundreds of stories, but one comes to mind. It occurred on an island off the coast of Australia. I was scheduled to visit a hospital there, and the ride across the island was just horrific. I think the driver found every pothole. By the time I arrived at the hospital, I found that I was in very great need of a bathroom facility. As I leapt out of the Jeep, I saw all of the doctors and nurses lined up in their spotless white uniforms. Their white shoes glistened in the tropical sunlight. There was one young nurse at the very end of the line. I rushed over to her. I whispered that I needed a bathroom very badly. The young lady took me by the hand and led me to the nurse's latrine. I used the facility, then went off to inspect the hospital. In the meantime, the young lady had taken up a piece of chalk, and she returned to the latrine. On the back of the door, she wrote, "Mrs. Roosevelt peed here." Well, before I got back into that Jeep, I followed Mother's advice and used the bathroom again. I saw the young lady's message, and so I picked up the chalk, and beneath I wrote, "Yes, she did, Mrs. Roosevelt." I have often wondered, did someone take that door home as a souvenir of the war? Oh, there were so many stories. That reminds me of one that I believe it was going around in New Guinea. Apparently, there was a young Marine there. He was very unhappy, very depressed. His officer asked, "What's the matter with you?" The young man replied, "Well, sir, I have been here for nearly 3 months, and I haven't shot one enemy soldier yet." Well, his officer said, "I'll tell you what to do. You see that hillside over there? I want you to go over there, and you shout out, 'To hell with Hirohito!' And all of the Japanese will jump up and you can shoot one." Well, the young man did as he was told, but he was still very unhappy. And his officer asked, "Did you do as I told you?" The young man replied, "Yes, sir, I did. I went over there. I shouted out, 'To hell with Hirohito!' And all of the Japanese jumped up and shouted back, 'To hell with Mrs. Roosevelt!' And you see, sir, I'm a Republican, so I couldn't shoot them." Oh, that war would take such a toll on America. We would never be the same. We had lost our innocence. There have been times when I thought the greatest toll was taken on my dearest Franklin. By December of 1944, it was evident to all of us that Franklin was a very sick man. Our granddaughter, Eleanor, had visited that Christmas from California. She had been in to see the president and then came to see me. She said, "Papa does not look well. He's very thin. His clothes don't fit." Franklin had lost nearly 40 pounds. In the spring of 1945, we had convinced the president to take a short vacation. Whenever he went to Warm Springs, he was re-energized, reinvigorated. I spoke to him on the telephone on the evening of April 11th. He said he was really feeling much better. His appetite had returned. He thought he'd be up to his old weight in no time. Before we said goodnight, he said to me, "Babs, I have always loved you best." I replied, "You will always be my best boy." That was the last time I ever spoke to him. The following day of April 12th, I was in Washington. It was a women's club meeting, a fundraiser. I received an urgent phone call from the White House. It was Mr. Stephen Early. He was an advisor to the president. He asked that I return to the White House immediately. He did not wish to discuss it on the telephone. Somehow, I knew what had happened. On that ride back to the White House, I had to fight to keep my mind clear. I thought about what it would be like to be alone now. I thought about what Franklin's death would mean for the country, and indeed for the world. When I arrived at the White House, I was greeted by Mr. Early and Dr. McIntyre. They told me that earlier in the day, the president had suffered a stroke, and that shortly before 3 o'clock, he had passed away. I asked to be left alone for a moment. All those 40 years streamed before my eyes. All the love, the joy, the grief, the betrayal. But it was over now. The story had ended. I then began to make all of the important phone calls. I spoke to Vice President Truman. He was such a kind gentleman. He said to me, "Mrs. Roosevelt, what can I do for you?" I replied, "What can I do for you, Mr. Truman? You are the one in trouble now. That evening, I flew down to Warm Springs, to the little cottage that Franklin had built there. The lights on the porch were always left burning whenever the president was at home. I was greeted at the door by Franklin's two cousins, Laura and Daisy, and his secretary, Miss Turley. I went into the room where my dearest one lay. I closed the door behind me. And again, all those years flowed before me. But it was over. It was finished. I came out into the living room of the cottage. I saw a large, unfinished portrait of the president there. I asked Cousin Laura who had commissioned that painting. She was very reluctant to tell me, but then she blurted out that Lucy Mercer had commissioned the painting. She further found it necessary to tell me that Lucy had been there with the president for the past 2 weeks. She was with him earlier when he lay dying. No. I would not let that old demon rise up and take hold of me. It was over. It was finished. The following morning, the president's body was placed aboard the train for the trip to Washington. Thousands of people had gathered there at the little station of Warm Springs to pay their respects. As the train pulled out of the station, I looked out. I saw a young black soldier, tears streaming down his face, and he sang out in a very loud and clear voice that old hymn, "I'm going home, I'm going home." And I thought, I am taking my dearest one home for the very last time. That night, as I lay there aboard the train, I looked out onto the darkened countryside, a countryside Franklin loved so well. People had gathered at the trackside to watch the train pass. Many of them held up signs. A man held a sign that read, "Roosevelt was my friend." A young woman held up a sign that read, "Roosevelt saved my family." My heart began to soften, and I began to understand how much this country had meant to Franklin and how much Franklin had meant to the country. Franklin had lost the use of his legs, but he taught a crippled country to walk again. After my husband's death, I thought that my years in public service had ended. I thought that I would merely retire to my house at Valkill, New York, and become a doting grandmother. But that is not meant to be. I have traveled the world over. I have been a witness at the birth of the new nation of Israel. I sat at sunset in the shadow of the Taj Mahal, a scene my father had related to me many times. My frequent traveling companion has been my granddaughter, Nina. She reminds me so much of myself when I was so very young, so awkward, so out of place, never really able to find some place where she belongs, some place that she can call home. President Truman has requested that I act as an ambassador to the newly organized United Nations. I do hope that this august body lives up to the expectations of Franklin, and I shall serve in that capacity as long as I am able, and I shall do my very best. In parting, I would like to leave you with a reminder. All of the young men who serve and fight for us are our young men. Their parents may be of a different race or religion, but they are all our young men. Your heart may be tied to just one young man, but it must be with them all. For when one of these young men dies alongside his buddies, he is our young man, so that we might continue to say, we live in the land of the free and the home of the brave. I shall leave you now with a short prayer, one that had sustained me through the long, dark years of the war. Dear Lord, if I become apathetic, if I become complacent, if I become too self-satisfied, let me always be reminded that somewhere out there, a young soldier has died for freedom. A young soldier has died for you. Let us ask and answer, is your freedom worth his dying? Are you worth his dying? Thank you. Thank you so very kindly. Thank you so very kindly. Do we have time for questions at all? Well, I shall answer a question. If I don't know the answer, I'll lie. Are there any questions, or have I just revealed every detail and dirty linen of the Roosevelt? Yes.
Nina? What happened to Nina?
She grew up. Married.
Did she find her place?
I think so. She found it in California. So she was very happy there. She was Franklin's daughter, not Franklin, my son. We had two sons named Franklin. She was Franklin's son to his fourth wife. I had to count. The question was, whatever happened to Nina, my granddaughter? I have 14 grandchildren. So there were 19 marriages amongst my 5 children, and they managed to produce 14 grandchildren as a result. They were serial monogamists, I bet you might call them. Are there any other questions that I might answer? Yes, madam.
Public television just happened.
I did not see it. I don't even know what PBS means. Is it?
Public television.
Oh, that's interesting. I've been on television. It's not a very widely known. It's just 1948, so I think it might grow in popularity. Yes, madam. I've just worked at it, I suppose. The lady asked, how did I become so professional? In what manner?
I'm just admiring your dramatization.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I've lived a very dramatic life. I hope I have a few years left. I'm feeling much better now. The lady asked, how did I become so proficient, I think it was. I just work at it a lot.
Amazing.
Well, thank you so very much. Thank you so very much. That's very kind. That's very kind. I left Eleanor's voice. It gets a little grating on your throat after a while. And I think this is what, our third one in a row. So, yes, madam.
Have you ever thought about doing Bess Truman?
No. No, she's lovely. I have her cookbook. The problem, the lady asked, have I ever considered Bess Truman? And the problem is she didn't say anything. She played bridge, she made fudge, occasionally some good molasses cookies, and I saw her toaster in Independence, and that was, yeah, she didn't really say anything. And she had a great effect on Harry, on Mr. Truman, whom I really admire greatly. But the effect that she had was, she was not a hands-on as Mrs. Roosevelt. In fact, Bess Truman shocked the press corps in Washington when the first thing she said, all the lovely reporters are gathered here today. Well, get comfortable, because you won't be back. I don't give interviews. I don't talk to reporters. I have nothing to say about what's going on in the Oval Office. If you have a question, you can ask Mr. Truman. He might know the answer. She really didn't have a great input. She was a little homebody. In fact, she actually spent more time in Independence than she did in Washington. That I think about all kinds of different ladies. Yes, ma'am.
How well did you get along with President Truman?
Very little. There was very little contact. You have to remember he was just elected in 1944, and there was very little interaction. In fact, prior to Roosevelt's death, he actually only invited Truman to the White House once. They had lunch in the garden.
But how did you get along after he became president?
Oh, very well. Very well. I didn't always agree with some of the decisions that he had to make. I shouldn't say I. Mrs. Roosevelt didn't agree with some of the decisions that Mr. Truman had to make, but it was necessary. There were things that had to be done, and he had to do it in the most expedient way possible. One comment about the Trumans and the Roosevelts. Mrs. Truman was invited to the White House. This was just after the election. It was January 1945. And some of the other senatorial wives said to her, "Eat before you go." Well, Bess was known for her healthy appetite. And she thought, oh, really, I'm going to the White House. And so she seated there at the table for lunch with the First Lady, with Mrs. Roosevelt, and they're chatting, and the butler comes in and he places a half of an egg salad sandwich in front of Bess and a cup of tea. And Bess is thinking, oh, like this is just, the nibbles will go. That was it. And then it was followed by chocolate pudding that came out of a can. And then she understood why she was told, eat before you go. The Roosevelts were not known for their fine cuisine. They just weren't. Yes, sir. Oh, golly, I guess the question was, did I find anything shocking or surprising about Eleanor in the research? I guess the most shocking thing, and I feel terrible, you can't look at my hands, she wore red nail polish. That was surprised me. And then when I actually studied her official White House portrait, I see, oh yeah, she's got red nail polish. That kind of surprised me. What surprised me about her is that she wrote letters to people, and this comes up in another situation. When she had a style of writing letters where she was very effusive and almost, Victorian romantic sort of letters, sometimes to perfect strangers. And that surprised me. I thought she was all sort of buttoned up, but I think perhaps that's how she released it. Another thing that really surprised me, the depth of depression that she suffered. She called them her Griselda Moods, and she could feel them coming, and they frightened her, and she fought very, very hard to keep it down. You can see in her face, it's in the summer of 1919, so we all know what happened that summer. And there's a photograph of Eleanor, Mother Sarah, Franklin, and the children. It's on the steps of the back porch of the house at Campobello. And you look at her face. Number one, you look at her face. There is such pain and anguish, but there's a body language. Sarah, Franklin, and the 5 children are clustered. Eleanor is about 2 feet away. And that just tells you how much she was suffering, but she kept it down. When she felt the need to cry, she went into the bathroom, turned the tub on, turned the water into the basin, and let it just run, and she cried. Then she was done. That surprised me, the level of really just absolutely bone-breaking depression that woman felt. She feared greatly falling into her mother's situation, and she never drank alcohol because she feared alcoholism. Her own father, Elliot, had died. Her brother, Hall, died as a result of his alcoholism. And so she controlled herself. Even though the president imbibed, we all know that, what did he do when he became president? He got rid of that thing called prohibition. And that was the first thing they would have he called it the children's hour. And they would have cocktails. And she was polite. She would hold the cocktail glass and sip and walk around and sip and, not really drinking that much of it because she feared that she might fall into that same trap. Well, thank you so kindly for coming to meet Mrs. Roosevelt this evening. Thank you so very much.